Welcome to this explainer. You know, if you really stop and look at the history of the technology industry, it often resembles this vast, rapidly expanding corporate graveyard. The cycle of disruption in tech is notoriously ruthless. Because of Moore's Law and the hyper-accelerated pace of innovation we've seen over the decades, tech giants, companies that literally defined entire generations of hardware and software, usually have incredibly short shelf lives. They dominate for a bit, then they lose relevance, they fail to pivot, and eventually they just fade away into total obscurity. Yet, amidst all of this constant brutal churn, one company has remained at the absolute center of computing for nearly half a century. From the era of those bulky beige personal computers to the invisible global networks of modern cloud computing, and now right to the bleeding edge of artificial intelligence, Microsoft has survived it all.
And this brings us to a really profound central mystery that we're going to unpack today. Entire industries have materialized and evaporated. Massive competitors with seemingly unlimited resources have come and gone. Surviving in the technology sector almost always requires a company to willingly cannibalize its own wildly successful products just to embrace the next paradigm, something that is notoriously difficult, almost impossible for massive corporations to actually execute. So how did they outlast almost every other early tech pioneer? How in the world did they manage to continue dominating through multiple disruptive generations of innovation while so many of their peers simply vanished?
Now, you might instinctively think their greatest advantage, the real bedrock of their survival, is Windows, or maybe Office. But the answer isn't actually a specific operating system or a piece of software. Their ultimate product, their defining competitive advantage, is actually their unprecedented capacity for corporate reinvention. They are the ultimate chameleon of the business world. Long before the market completely forces them out of a shifting landscape, they adapt, they rebuild, and they redeploy.
Let's start with part 1, building a software empire.
Back in the early days, when Bill Gates and Paul Allen first surveyed the very nascent personal computing landscape in the 1970s, they saw a massive vulnerability that the hardware manufacturers completely missed. They realized that physical machines would eventually just become interchangeable commodities. Software, not hardware, was where the real leverage lived, and their defining stroke of absolute genius came in 1981 with the IBM MS-DOS partnership. See, IBM didn't want to buy the software outright, so Microsoft licensed their operating system to them. But crucially, and this is the kicker, they retained the right to license that exact same software to other computer makers. By creating this non-exclusive license, Microsoft effectively positioned themselves as the inevitable tax collector for the entire booming PC clone revolution. By the time Windows launched in 1985 and Office followed up in 1990, they had established an ecosystem that fundamentally dictated exactly how corporate environments functioned.
To really wrap our heads around why they became virtually untouchable in this era, we have to look at the sheer gravity of network effects. Because everyone used Office, businesses basically had to use it simply to share files with each other. You couldn't be the one company using something else. But the real lock-in happened beneath the surface with the Win32 API. Because businesses relied on Windows, software developers were practically forced to write their applications specifically for Windows. Building software for competing operating systems just became financially unviable. This created a massive, self-reinforcing developer ecosystem. The more apps Windows had, the more users it attracted, which in turn attracted even more developers. It was a flawless moat that made their early dominance seem completely and utterly impenetrable.
But nothing lasts forever, right? That brings us to part 2, the crisis years.
Of course, those early breakthroughs wouldn't protect them indefinitely. Despite their massive world-dominating success in the 90s, by the 2000s, many industry analysts genuinely believed their best years were firmly behind them. The empire was stagnating. The brutal browser wars with Internet Explorer had triggered devastating antitrust lawsuits, and these legal battles didn't just cost them a ton of money, they fundamentally distracted leadership and birthed a highly risk-averse, paranoid corporate culture. Instead of innovating, they were just constantly playing defense, and this internal paralysis meant that, during the Steve Ballmer era, Microsoft entirely missed the smartphone revolution. Just completely whiffed it. They were suddenly facing aggressive, highly agile mobile competition, and their once unbreakable grip on the tech market was slipping incredibly fast.
The core of this crisis was a profound architectural and philosophical disconnect. Think about it. Microsoft was desperately trying to cram a heavy, legacy desktop computing paradigm onto tiny mobile screens, stubbornly clinging to the familiar Windows interface. Meanwhile, their competitors, namely Apple and Google, were aggressively building native smartphones and entirely new mobile app ecosystems right from the ground up. To the outside world, Microsoft seemed absolutely destined to slowly fade into a boring, legacy IT provider, basically just servicing old servers, while the rest of the world captured the exciting, highly lucrative new mobile frontier.
But here is where the story pivots.
Part 3. The Cloud Comeback.
Missing mobile actually served as the necessary, painful catalyst for one of the greatest corporate pivots in business history. Realizing they couldn't win the old way, they decided to just change the game entirely. This all began with the appointment of Satya Nadella as CEO, who engineered a massive cultural shift. He transitioned Microsoft from a defensive, arrogant, know-it-all culture to an open, curious, learn-it-all culture. This shift allowed them to embrace open-source technologies and Linux, something that was totally unthinkable in the Ballmer era. They shifted to a cloud-first strategy, transitioned away from traditional boxed software, and acquired crucial strategic assets like LinkedIn and the developer hub GitHub. Buying GitHub was huge because it completely rebuilt their heavily damaged relationship with the global developer community.
But look, transitioning to the cloud wasn't just a simple change in corporate philosophy or some nice PR spin. It required a staggering, eye-watering financial commitment. Nadella directed massive capital expenditure straight into building global cloud data centers and AI infrastructure. They were entirely rebuilding the ship while it was sailing, weaponizing their massive cash reserves to build an infrastructure moat that new startups couldn't possibly afford to replicate. They were betting the entire farm on the Azure cloud platform, pouring billions and billions into server farms globally just to compete head-on with Amazon Web Services.
Now, this transition was incredibly painful in the short term, but the mechanics of this pivot to software as a service ultimately saved the company. By moving away from perpetual physical box software licenses to Microsoft 365 monthly and yearly subscriptions, they sacrificed immediate revenue spikes for long-term, highly predictable recurring revenue. And Wall Street absolutely rewarded this predictable cash flow. The explosive revenue growth of the Azure cloud platform and these subscriptions quickly began outpacing their legacy sales. This SaaS pivot provided the robust global infrastructure and the massive financial war chest they desperately needed to prepare for the next major technological wave.
And that wave is here. Part 4, the AI revolution.
Today, the real product isn't traditional software anymore. The cloud comeback laid the necessary foundation, but the current chapter in generative AI is proving to be their most significant leap yet. Their strategy goes way, way beyond their highly publicized exclusive partnership with OpenAI. They didn't just invest in AI, they embedded it directly into the everyday workflows of the global workforce. By integrating Microsoft Copilot into Word, Excel, and enterprise data through the Microsoft Graph, they transformed generative AI from a fun public chatbot novelty into a secure, indispensable tool for Fortune 500 companies. And it is all powered by that massive GPU cloud infrastructure they built during the Azure pivot.
The sheer scale of this ambition becomes really clear when you compare it to their biggest rivals. While Google is largely focused on search-centric AI, and Amazon provides foundational models for independent builders, Microsoft has engineered a sweeping full-stack dominance. They own the underlying silicon and hardware compute layer through Azure, they have premier access to the foundational model layer via OpenAI, and they control the user-facing application layer with Copilot and Office. They're effectively capturing immense value at every single level of the AI supply chain, all at the exact same time.
This full-stack approach creates an incredibly powerful modern flywheel. Let's break that down. The more enterprise customers use AI features in Copilot, the more massive computing power is required. That required compute directly drives up Azure cloud revenue. That increased cloud revenue is then funneled right back into funding further OpenAI research and better models, which makes Copilot even more capable, attracting even more usage. Every layer of the business feeds the other. They are creating an AI-driven network effect for the 2020s that is remarkably similar to that impenetrable lock-in they achieved with Windows back in the 90s.
But the story doesn't end here. Part 5, the next battle.
Microsoft knows better than anyone that the market will inevitably shift again, and no lead is ever permanent. To survive the next 50 years, they are pouring unimaginable resources into the vectors that will define tomorrow. They are actively preparing for artificial general intelligence, a threshold that will completely change the fundamental nature of how code is written and executed. They are aggressively researching quantum computing, which has the terrifying potential to instantly break current global encryption standards, making their parallel investments in next-generation cybersecurity absolutely critical. The only way they survive is by continuously laying the groundwork right now for whatever the next computing paradigm turns out to be.
Ultimately, the core takeaway from this explainer isn't about being first. As we've seen, the companies that shape history aren't always the ones that invent the future first. They are the ones that successfully adapt to it. Microsoft didn't invent the personal computer. They didn't invent the internet. They entirely missed the mobile revolution. And they didn't even invent generative AI. But time and time again, they successfully adapted their massive corporate structure to dominate the very markets those specific technologies created. Continuous transformation is their true legacy.
And that means the cycle of survival is never truly over. The moment a company believes it is permanently won is the exact moment it begins to die. Whether it's the sheer mind-bending processing power of quantum computing, the unpredictable reality of AGI, or a disruptive technology we haven't even imagined yet, the landscape will radically change again. By understanding this half-century history of relentless, calculated adaptation, the real question isn't how they survived this long. The real question is, what new technology will force Microsoft's next reinvention? Thanks for joining us, and keep questioning the future.
Thanks for watching World Decoded. Make sure to like and share, subscribe, and stay curious.